Black summer. Ava hated rushing and being late more than anything, so they got to the station early. A pile of bags in place at the post for the right stop. She breathed with relief. They were early. She didn't know that strange events were about to take place, events that would torment her for the rest of her life. Papa Makiewicz decided to take a detour to the buffet in the time before the departure of the bus. Adam and Ava sat patiently on the bench, hoping to get some pastries and lemonade soon, but Father simply didn't show up. The bus was already there, and all the other passengers with tickets had gotten on. And then the ones who bought their tickets from the bus driver had gotten on, and Ava had almost lost her earlier composure. Finally, Pan Makiewicz did show up, but there was no reasonable explanation for the strange state he was in. On the surface, it seemed as though he'd got absolutely drunk in a quarter of an hour. He was barely on his feet. He could manage nothing but an unintelligible grumble, and he looked frighteningly awful, like an epileptic demon prince. The bus driver didn't let him on, and Mom drove off alone with the child. Revulsion, nesting in the depths of her heart anyway, exploded onto the surface as blind rage, burying under itself any sympathy or even interest in the supernatural transformation that had struck her husband. Left were only fear and the blind urge to get going, to get away as soon as possible. Papa arrived 2 days later, but it would have been better if he hadn't. There had clearly been some kind of collapse in his mental state. There wasn't a drop of vodka in the country house, and the store was kilometres away, so booze was not to blame. But his story was incomprehensibly confused, as if from another reality. He seemed to have completely forgotten where and with whom he was. He called his wife Marina and his child by strange names. He missed his mouth when he ate, so that his food fell into his beard and onto the front of his shirt. And he couldn't light a cigarette, not because his hands trembled, but because there was a complete lack of coordination between the parts of his body, his thoughts, and his actions. To top things off, Pan Makiewicz stepped on a horribly thick rusty nail that was sticking out of a fallen roof board on the floor of the collapsed barn. Ava soaked his foot in a bowl in which the water turned instantly red, and bucket after bucket had to be hauled out of the well. Eventually the foot was bandaged up with several rags. From then on, Pan Cleric largely remained in bed, as the leg could not support him with its stigma. It was swollen, blue around the wound, and horribly painful. A journey to the city was out of the question. So they were condemned to stay there until Father's leg healed to the point where he could limp the few kilometres to the bus stop. Ava looked for as much field work as she could, because to be in a room together with her deranged husband was horrible. He sat at the table in the kitchen and littered the space around him with tobacco crumbs, matches, and disconnected thoughts. He'd found an old yellowed notebook from somewhere and wrote down the reigns of the kings of Poland in strange, wobbling handwriting that was different on every line. On one page, Jakob had drawn up a plan for the barn and earnestly contemplated how to build a new house from the ruins. Some of the walls were still standing, after all. The boundaries of the kitchen and rooms were drawn up freehand, the door and window openings marked out, and the floor was to be of stone rubble. Some part of his brain worked perfectly, because all the kings were written out correctly, and no one who had ever ruled Poland was missing. Another job he could still handle, despite his poor condition, was to sit in a chair with garden scissors and snip the bushes near the house. Ava wasn't strong enough to take him further away. Pan Makiewicz did this with the utmost dedication. Only the higher bushes were left completely uncut, and an onlooker might have assumed that goats had been eating in the garden. Only imagine that 15 years ago they had met in secret here in the countryside, both young and in love. At the time he seemed to Ava the smartest man, with the darkest beard, the longest fingers, the highest forehead, and with many well-known friends. In hindsight, it can be said that Ava was still most impressed by the fact that the Makiewiczes lived in the past, as much mentally as materially. The Szlachta privileges had not been lost. They carried them on in the blood, in their attitude to the world, in their manners, and in their decaying, mouldy morals. In that distant and beautiful late summer, they discovered each other's virtues, although they may not have seemed like virtues at the time. Ava's long and well-formed legs, her round shoulders, or Jakob's endless tirades on religious and historical issues. They went on long, warm, golden mushrooming trips in the evenings until it got dark, and until their feet were tender on the bottom from trudging on the ends of pine cones that had sunk into the soft moss. They made a fire in the kitchen, and the old stove with rusty hinges sighed powerful heat while they cleaned their catch of soil and thorns. Jakob knew all the varieties of mushrooms, those that could be made safe by boiling and those that could not, and they argued for a bit about the brown rimroll, which Ava thought was inedible, like the slippery jack. The slippery jack does actually cause indigestion. Jakob grabbed the field guide off the shelf. Bah! See? Low-quality edible mushroom, he said, jabbing the book with a dirty finger. The potato was already boiling, and the sauce was made with a good lot of sour cream, which tasted slightly bitter, like their young love. In the country, Adam lived a free child's wild life. That big people's things had gotten out of hand did not affect him very much. Children are very adaptable, otherwise they'd never survive into adulthood. We may think that the sins of parents are hung around the necks of children, but children themselves can't tell the difference. Sitting inside at mealtimes was painfully annoying, but Ava insisted that the boy arrive at lunch and dinner on time and brooked no argument. If he wasn't there for some reason, she went through the huts she thought he might be playing in, grabbed the boy by the arm and dragged him home. Sometimes the table was laid out in the yard. Well, laid out. An old grey table with rickety legs lifted and placed against the corner of the house, an oilcloth tablecloth, and then blue-rimmed plates, a bowl of boiled potatoes or boiled beans, some fresh or sour milk, and a sausage soup or some other simple food. And the child had a good appetite, because fresh air and lots of running around will make a child hungry. Food was expensive stuff, and there was never too much at home, never enough that you could just go and take some whenever you wanted. Instead, you had to ride your bike to the store. They would come home with 1 brown bread and 1 white bread, a packet of sour cream and a sausage link. But they were 3 people. On his own, Adam would have been able to put away a single trip's worth of food. Ava's art was to stretch the store foods into hearty meals with only her domestic methods, as if she'd put a magnifying glass on it. 2 potatoes, a handful of noodles, and a pair of bones made a soup that could be eaten for 2 days in a row. Only a person working in straitened circumstances studies and knows this miracle of cooking. Once, when he was walking by the sea, Adam almost drowned when the wind picked up his beach ball and rolled it out over the waves. He trudged after it until the water was suddenly too deep and the shore too far. It was very blue and blindingly shiny around the thin little body struggling in the water. The ball was already happily flying off to Rostock or Malmö and well out of reach, and somehow, with a struggle that nearly killed him, Adam kicked and flailed his way back to shore. After this unfortunate incident, he didn't even want to see water for several summers. Ava only found out about the story a few years later, when she began to ask why her son never set off to the beach. Adam didn't tell them anything at first. As is clear, they had plenty of worries aside from his drowning. The same summer, he succeeded in nearly slicing his palm in half on the bottom of a bottle, and the blood spilled out horribly. Then he was playing with the girls in the village, and somehow this mishap happened again. But it's nothing. Boys have scars everywhere. That grim and bloody summer also had its brighter moments. A frequent visitor to the garden was the neighbour's young black-spotted cat, who was adventurous and playful. Having enticed the cat into the house with a drop of milk, Ava put on an old oven mitt and waved it about in front of the cat's nose. She wore the oven mitt in order to shed a little less blood. The cat certainly didn't take any care with its claws. And Ava had heard that one man in the next village had had to have his leg cut off. The scratches from his cat had gotten so bad that there'd been nothing left to do but to pick up the sore. His own cat's scratches! The locals could hear Adam's mother chuckling in the kitchen. "She's playing with Pipsqueak," Adam said contentedly. He was happy for his mother. Even the worst, rainiest of days pass by if you find something to do instead of looking on abjectly from a corner. Pani Ava cut the grass with a scythe, brought eggs from the neighbours, stacked hay, trimmed hedges, hoed the planters, and tried to pretend that everything was more or less as it should be. The berry bushes in the garden were old, overgrown, and covered in mildew, so she tried to uproot them, and as she was toiling, a branch of a cherry tree poked her in the eye, which was awfully painful and nearly blinded her. The eye swelled shut, went blue, then black, dripped fluid, and was hellishly painful night and day. She placed an eye bandage over it like a pirate. It remains unexplained how such bandages, connected diagonally around the head, stay in place for pirates, because Ava's tried to tumble off all the time. Even sewing it to her skin might not have helped. She had scratched the membrane off her eye. The doctor said so, the doctor she saw a week later in the city. The treatment took more than a month, but eventually there was no permanent injury. The same could not be said for Pan Makiewicz, who was confined in an institution for more than 2 months of treatment. But Papa Makiewicz was never the same again. The family would later refer to this summer as the Black Summer.